excited to be speaking this segment with John Bursch. John Bursch is the Vice President of Appellate Advocacy at Alliance Defending Freedom. Most importantly, John Bursch will be arguing the Harris Funeral Home case in front of the U.S. Supreme Court tomorrow, October 8th. John has argued, I think it's 11 cases already before the Supreme Court, including Obergefell, the gay marriage decision. And this case is a case that very few people know anything about. It is one of the most important cases, certainly happening right now, maybe one of the most important cases in American history, because it will take up the question of gender identity. It will take up the question of what do we mean by sex in the law? What do we mean by gender identity? As transgenderism and the gender ideology has overtaken our public discourse, this case is going to really show us which way the wind is blowing and how our legal system is going to follow that. So pleased to have John Bursch here. John, thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Michael. Always a pleasure to speak with you.
So, John, obviously, you're a little busy today. I'll try not to take up too much of your time. You've got a lot going on. Just quickly, could you give people who I suspect haven't really heard about this case the broad outlines of what is going on here?
Yeah, this case is about nothing less than whether Americans and businesses will be able to rely on the law the way that it's written, rather than having an unelected public official change the meaning of a law out from under them and then punish them for that. The case involves a funeral home that's located in Michigan that serves grieving families in Detroit. It's done that as a family business for more than 100 years. The funeral home has a sex-specific dress code that it applies to men and women, dress suits for women and pantsuits and ties for men that has never been an issue before. And they do that because they want to be able to allow their clients to focus on processing their grief and not on the funeral home and its employees. In 2007, a biological male applied and received a job as a funeral home director, which is the face of the funeral home, interacting with the grieving families, and made a commitment to follow that sex-specific dress code. Nearly 6 years later, the employee came back, presented the owner with a letter, said that they would be gone for 2 weeks, and when they came back, they would be presenting and dressing as a woman with those grieving families. After the funeral home owner thought about that over 2 weeks, the impact on the employee and the employee's wife, on the other female employees who'd be sharing a restroom, on the clients at the funeral home, the owner decided that was not something he could go along with. And so the EEOC, the federal agency charged with enforcing our nation's employment discrimination laws, decided to use Tom's case as a test case to rewrite the meaning of sex in federal law. They accused Tom of sex discrimination, and the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with that and said that sex essentially means transgender status, and that's why we're arguing in the U.S. Supreme Court.
That is the central question. This isn't the first time it's come up. The place I really remember first seeing this distinction between sex and so-called gender identity was in college and high school sports. So, Title IX establishes sports leagues for women, basically says that women get to have their own sports leagues so they can compete in high schools and colleges. And that's all well and good until recently. This new interpretation of sex as gender identity more or less abolishes the women's sports league. So, for instance, with these girls in Connecticut who are running track, they can't win races, they can't win championships, they can't win scholarships because biological males will identify as girls, and then they've been winning all of the track meets. So it made it clear to me, at least, that it's not like you could just have the definition of sex and then you could add on to that this new protection of gender identity. It seems pretty clear to me. You get one or the other, but you can't get both. And in this case, the facts of this case seem even clearer to me. I mean, this employee, Anthony Stevens, who now goes by Amy Stevens, had signed a contract. I mean, signed a document saying, I will abide by this dress code. And then 6 years later, all of a sudden, you see a change in that dress code, especially in a business like a funeral home where you've got grieving families all around you. It's not about the employees at those funeral homes. It's about, especially in that industry, the people who are coming in. They're very emotionally vulnerable, and it's really about them and about providing them some care. I'm surprised it's even made it up to the Supreme Court. I mean, I'm glad that you're going to be arguing it, and you're obviously highly, highly intelligent and articulate and have real clarity on this. How did we even get to this point where it came to the Supreme Court?
Well, we're as surprised as you are. It was obviously an effort by the previous administration to do by executive agency what they were unable to accomplish through Congress. And anybody who's taken government class in fifth grade knows that unelected officials, whether they be in the agencies or on the courts, don't get to make up the law. That's something that only Congress can do. And the argument that the EEOC made and that the Sixth Circuit accepted, and I will note the federal government has now changed position and is on our side, and it's the ACLU carrying the ball forward on the other side. Their argument was that because Stevens was a man who wanted to dress as a woman, and the funeral home would let women dress as women, that somehow that was sex discrimination. But they got it exactly wrong. Stevens was a man who wanted to violate the sex-specific dress code. A woman who wanted to follow the sex-specific dress code was not similarly situated. Mm-hmm. The whole point of Title VII was to prohibit women from being treated less well than men, or vice versa. And what the EEOC asked for, and the Sixth Circuit said, was that an employer has to treat men as though they are women, which, as you can understand, is a completely different concept and plays right into the sports situation you were talking about. In Connecticut, 2 boys identifying as girls have won 15 individual state track and field championships in the last 2 years. Wow. That used to be held by 9 girls. And you know what the EEOC officials said in Connecticut when asked about the unfairness of that situation? Girls have the right to participate, but they don't have the right to win. Absolutely incredible.
Wow.
And this plays out in other areas too. If you think about public accommodations and housing. Up in Alaska, there's an overnight women's shelter, and the local government there was insisting that the shelter had to allow a man presenting as a woman to sleep in the same room, bare feet away from women who had been raped, trafficked, and abused. And again, these are just some of the natural consequences when you redefine the meaning of sex as a matter of federal law.
I mean, and in that might be the most egregious, but it's the clearest example of it, which is you have a shelter specifically because these women have been abused by men. This is a place explicitly not for men. It is a protection on the basis of sex. This is a sex protection. And yet, when you redefine the word sex, you completely obliterate that protection, and the victims are these women who have come to a place to avoid being around men. They've been victimized, and now all of a sudden they're told, you are not permitted to have that. I wonder where the outcry is. I think wasn't there a documentary about Ruth Bader Ginsburg called On the Basis of Sex? This used to be such a proud pillar of American law, and now it looks like we're erasing that protection, and we're not even doing it the legal way. We're not even doing it through the legislature and convincing people's fellow citizens and passing laws. They're just trying to do it at the court level. And I think it plays into a major frustration that Americans have, which is that we feel like we can't control our own government anymore. We feel as though we can't even enforce laws that have been on the books for decades and decades because some judge is going to rewrite it. What sort of say do we have in our government?
Well, that's what makes this case particularly frustrating for the funeral home and its owner, because the U.S. Supreme Court for the last 40 years has interpreted Title VII as requiring proof that women have been treated worse than men or vice versa. It has never suggested that Title VII requires that men be treated as women. And again, the EEOC already said that sex-specific dress policies were okay as far as they didn't burden one sex more than the other. And so this was a complete rewrite of the statute. It was done at the behest of an unelected agency and then accomplished by an unelected Sixth Circuit panel. And it leaves businesses and individuals in the situation where they cannot rely on the law the way that it's written. And that's the exact opposite of the way our democratic government is supposed to work.
And there's a level even beyond politics, even beyond self-government, which is the level of reality. Ryan Anderson has a great op-ed today in the New York Post titled, "Will the Supreme Court Stand Up for Reality?" And what this case seems to be about at bottom is, will we interpret the law according to objective reality, or will we rewrite the law in accordance with subjective preference, which to me, it not only does it seem obviously distasteful on its face, But it seems impossible, because if you are then turning the law into some subjective exercise in how people are feeling on one day or the other, how is this funeral home owner ever going to know how to react to his employees, who one day may identify with one gender and another day may identify with another, as plenty of people have done in recent years?
Well, and it's even more complicated than that for the poor owner of a business. There was a deposition of the employee, Stevens, and the question point blank was, well, what if you had a male who was bald and had a beard? Would the funeral home have to allow that person to wear a dress and high heels when meeting with the grieving family members and friends of a lost loved one? And Stevens' answer was, well, no, not in that situation, because that person wouldn't play the part of a woman. And so the position the other side is asking businesses to engage in is to stereotype and decide who looks womanly enough or manly enough to wear certain types of clothes and to wear jewelry and things like that. And the whole point of Title VII was to get employers out of the business of trying to decide who looked womanly or manly enough. So the whole exercise just turns the statute on its head, and it's a total morass for poor employers who are supposed to try to figure out what to do in these circumstances.
This is an irony I hadn't even considered, because you hear this a lot from some feminists who oppose this new gender ideology. You can't even refer to it as the gender ideology, because the goalposts keep moving. It seems to change every single day. But they oppose it because they say, we're feminists. We think that women should define womanhood, and we don't want to be put into stereotyped boxes and told we have to be a certain way on the basis of what men think. And then the gender ideology comes along, and as you just described, says, well, a bald man in a beard doesn't play the part of what I have determined femininity to be. I mean, this is what we get into when we start interpreting law and basing law on subjective feelings rather than on objective reality. I know this decision has been a long time coming, but you've argued before the Supreme Court before on many occasions. I think at one point you argued 6% of all cases before the Supreme Court in a term. What sort of precedent will this set? I mean, this seems to me to be one of the most important cases for the future of our culture and for the future of